Here is a bulletin from CBS News. In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. The first reports say that President Kennedy has been seriously wounded by this shooting. From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time.
July 5th, 2025. A congressional task force releases a file that the CIA had been fighting to keep secret for over 60 years. Inside that file is a CIA officer named George Joannides, a psychological warfare specialist running covert operations out of Miami in 1963, a man who was funding and directing a Cuban exile group called the DRE, a group that had direct physical contact with Lee Harvey Oswald just 3 months before President Kennedy was shot. For 62 years, across 4 separate government investigations, the CIA denied any connection between this officer, this group, and Oswald. The newly released file proves every one of those denials was a lie. The chair of the congressional task force that secured the file said it plainly. We just learned definitively that the CIA has been lying for 62 years about the assassination of an American president. Not speculating, not suggesting. Definitively. So let's go back to that November day in Dallas, because what happened there and what the government has been hiding about it is finally starting to become clear. To understand November 22nd, 1963, you have to understand who John Kennedy was threatening. When JFK walked into the White House in January 1961, he inherited a CIA and a military establishment that had spent 15 years building a vast covert apparatus. Operations in Iran, in Guatemala, in the Congo, assassination plots against foreign leaders, proxy conflicts across multiple continents, much of it conducted in secrecy and often with limited public visibility or oversight. JFK was not impressed, and he was not afraid to say so. He fired CIA Director Allen Dulles after the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion, a CIA-backed operation intended to overthrow Fidel Castro that ended in failure. Kennedy also removed the agency's deputy director and its chief of covert operations. He reportedly told aides he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. He later moved to increase White House control over covert activity. He shut down certain operations and often resisted pressure from intelligence and military figures pushing for more aggressive action. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, he rejected calls from some military leaders for airstrikes and invasion plans that carried the risk of escalating into a nuclear confrontation. He also pursued back-channel communications with Soviet Premier Khrushchev aimed at reducing Cold War tensions. He began reducing the American advisory presence in Vietnam at a time when others were arguing for deeper involvement. And he signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty with the Soviet Union, a major shift toward easing tensions during one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War. JFK was not simply governing. He was challenging powerful institutions and competing visions of American foreign policy. That context matters, because it helps explain why debates surrounding Kennedy's assassination have remained so intense for decades. And it explains why what happened next would become one of the most scrutinized events in modern history. November 22nd, 1963, Dallas, Texas. President Kennedy arrives for a political trip through Texas. He gets into an open-top limousine with his wife Jackie, Texas Governor John Connally, and Connally's wife Nellie. They ride through downtown Dallas. Crowds line the streets. It is a warm Friday afternoon. Then shots ring out. Kennedy is hit in the neck and head. Governor Connally is also wounded. The president is rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital. At 1 p.m., he is pronounced dead. Within hours, the prime suspect is identified. Lee Harvey Oswald, 24 years old, former Marine, a self-declared communist who had defected to the Soviet Union in 1959, lived there for nearly 3 years, then returned to the United States. He is arrested at a movie theater about 90 minutes after the assassination. 2 days later, while being transferred between police facilities, nightclub owner Jack Ruby walks out from a crowd of police officers and news cameras and shoots Oswald at point-blank range. Oswald dies. There is no trial, no testimony, no cross-examination. the FBI quickly takes control of the investigation. Director J. Edgar Hoover states early that investigators had identified Oswald as the shooter and expresses confidence in the lone gunman conclusion. President Lyndon Johnson creates the Warren Commission to investigate the assassination. 10 months later, the commission releases its report, more than 700 pages. Its conclusion: Oswald acted alone and fired 3 shots. And almost immediately, people start asking questions, because the official story has problems. Serious ones. Let me tell you about the magic bullet. The Warren Commission faced a mathematical problem. On the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building, where Oswald allegedly fired from, police found 3 empty shell casings. Only 3, meaning only 3 shots were fired, but the physical evidence showed far more than 3 wounds. Kennedy was hit in the neck and the back of the head. Connolly was hit in the back, his rib was shattered, he was hit in the wrist, shattering the bone, and he had a wound in his thigh. If Oswald fired only 3 bullets, and 1 missed completely, that means 1 bullet had to have caused 7 separate wounds across 2 different human bodies, sitting in different positions in the car. The Warren Commission called this the single bullet theory. Critics, including members of the Warren Commission itself, immediately called it the magic bullet theory, because what that bullet allegedly did defies basic physics. Governor Connolly, the man who was supposedly wounded by that bullet, said publicly that he did not believe the single bullet theory. Quote, "I don't happen to believe that." He maintained that position for the rest of his life. And then there is the Zapruder film. Abraham Zapruder was a Dallas dress manufacturer who happened to be filming Kennedy's motorcade with his home movie camera. His film captured the assassination in graphic detail. The FBI got the film, and for 12 years, it was kept from the American public. When it finally aired on national television in 1975, the reaction was immediate. The film appeared to show Kennedy's head snapping backward after the fatal shot, consistent with a shot coming from the front, not from the building behind him where Oswald was positioned. If the shot came from the front, there had to be a second shooter. If there was a second shooter, Oswald did not act alone. And then there is the other thing the Zapruder film shows. On the grassy knoll, a raised area to the front right of the motorcade, multiple witnesses reported seeing a puff of smoke and hearing a shot coming from that direction immediately after the final shot. More than 50 witnesses reported hearing shots from the grassy knoll. The Warren Commission found 0 of them credible enough to investigate seriously. Here is what we know about Lee Harvey Oswald that the Warren Commission did not want to examine too closely.
Did you kill the president?
No, I've not been charged with that. In fact, nobody has said that to me yet. The first thing I heard about it was when the newspaper reporters in the hall asked me that question.
You have been.
Nobody said what?
Sir?
You have been.
Oswald was not just a random disgruntled communist. He was a man surrounded by intelligence connections so dense that calling him a lone gunman strains credibility in ways that get more obvious every time new documents are released. He joined the Marines at 17 and was assigned to a classified U-2 spy plane base in Japan. He learned Russian fluently, which in the 1950s required intensive instruction that the Marines did not officially provide to ordinary enlisted men. At 20, he defected to the Soviet Union. He walked into the American embassy, announced he was defecting, and said he planned to give military secrets to the Soviets. The American government's response to this act of apparent treason? They let him come back to the United States 3 years later. No prosecution, no detention, no serious questioning, he just walked back in. He then settled in New Orleans, where he ran a one-man chapter of something called the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, a pro-Castro organization in New Orleans in 1963. And here's where it gets critical. While Oswald was handing out pro-Castro leaflets on the streets of New Orleans in August 1963, he got into a public confrontation with a group of Cuban exiles. The confrontation was filmed. It was covered by local news. It went on local television. Oswald debated these Cuban exiles on air. The whole incident painted Oswald publicly as a communist pro-Castro agitator. Now, Who were those Cuban exiles? They were members of the Cuban Student Directorate, an anti-Castro group funded and directed by the CIA through a psychological warfare officer in Miami named George Joannides. The CIA's own officer was running the group that staged a very public confrontation with Oswald that put his face on television as a communist 3 months before the assassination. And for 62 years, the CIA said it had no knowledge of any of this. No connection to Oswald, no connection to the DRE, no idea. In July 2025, the CIA's own file on George Joannides proved every word of that was a lie. 6 weeks before the assassination, Oswald traveled to Mexico City. He went to both the Cuban and Soviet embassies, apparently trying to get visas that would let him travel to Cuba and the Soviet Union. The CIA had both embassies under heavy surveillance, phone taps, cameras watching every person who entered and left, a full wiretapping operation that intercepted every phone call coming in and going out. And here is what those surveillance records revealed, and what the CIA has been struggling to explain ever since. The CIA's surveillance tapes from Mexico City captured phone calls from a man identifying himself as Lee Harvey Oswald to the Soviet embassy. There is just one problem. The voice on those tapes was not Oswald's voice. FBI agents who listened to the tapes and then met Oswald after his arrest confirmed it immediately. The voice on the Mexico City tapes was not the same man. And the physical description in the CIA's own surveillance reports of the man photographed entering the Soviet embassy did not match Oswald either. The CIA described the man as approximately 6 feet tall, athletic build, around 35 years old with a receding hairline. Oswald was 5'9", slender, and 24 years old. Someone was impersonating Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico City, making calls to the Soviet embassy, being photographed entering Soviet diplomatic premises, creating a paper trail connecting Oswald to Soviet intelligence. And here is the most disturbing part. The CIA's own internal documents show that the Mexico City station was aware of the discrepancy. They knew the voice didn't match. They knew the physical description didn't match. And when they sent their summary to the Warren Commission, the information about the impersonation was removed. The version the Warren Commission received described Oswald as if he personally made those calls and visited those embassies without any mention that the CIA had reason to doubt it. A whistleblower who worked with the House Select Committee on assassinations in the late 1970s reported seeing an internal CIA document that appeared to boast about how the agency had handled and sanitized its presentation to the congressional investigators. The CIA was not just withholding evidence. According to this account, they were proud of it. Let's go back to George Joannides, because this is the most important development in the JFK story in decades. Joannides was a CIA psychological warfare specialist. In 1963, he was based in Miami, running operations that included funding and directing the DRE, the Cuban exile group that had the public confrontation with Oswald in New Orleans. When the House Select Committee on Assassinations reopened the JFK investigation in the late 1970s, the CIA assigned George Joannides as the agency's liaison to the committee, the man responsible for facilitating information sharing between the CIA and the congressional investigators. The man who had run the group that staged a public confrontation with Oswald 3 months before the assassination was now in charge of deciding what information the CIA shared with the people investigating that assassination. The investigators on the committee did not know who Joannides was. They did not know his connection to the DRE. The CIA did not tell them. When investigators asked about a CIA officer known by the codename Howard, who had connections to the DRE, Joannides himself denied any knowledge of such a person. He was Howard. He was sitting in the room denying his own existence to investigators who were trying to find him. In 2025, the newly released Joannides file confirmed all of this. A CIA memo dated January 17, 1963, directed Joannides to operate under the alias Howard Gebler and to obtain a fake driver's license in that name. The file confirmed his role as the DRE's officer. The file confirmed his direct operational connection to the group that publicly entangled itself with Oswald. And then, in 1981, 2 years after the House Select Committee concluded its investigation, the CIA gave George Joannides its Career Intelligence Medal, one of the agency's highest honors. They gave a medal to the man who deceived their own Congressional Oversight Committee investigating a presidential assassination. Jefferson Morley, the journalist who spent over a decade suing the CIA to release the Joannides files, said it plainly. The cover story for Joannides is officially dead. A Congressional Task Force chairwoman was even more direct. We just learned definitively that the CIA has been lying for 62 years about the assassination of an American president. Let me walk you through the main theories about who killed JFK and what the evidence says about each one. Theory 1. Oswald acting alone. This is the official story, and 60 years of investigation have not produced a single piece of definitive evidence that contradicts it as the description of who pulled the trigger. Oswald had motive, opportunity, and the physical means. He also maintained until his death that he was innocent. The physical evidence is genuinely contested by serious forensic experts. Theory 2. The Soviet Union or Cuba. This was what the original cover-up was designed to prevent Americans from believing. LBJ himself worried that if people thought the Soviets or Cubans were behind it, public pressure would force a military response that could escalate into nuclear war. The evidence for direct Soviet or Cuban involvement is thin. Theory 3. The Mafia. This has significant documented support. Ruby's connections to Trafficante and Marcello are real. Marcello reportedly made statements suggesting involvement. The Mafia had enormous motivation. The Kennedy administration's Justice Department under Robert Kennedy was aggressively pursuing organized crime in a way no previous administration had. And the Mafia's involvement in CIA anti-Castro operations meant they had connections to both the intelligence community and the resources to organize something like this. Theory 4. Rogue elements within the CIA. This is the theory that the newly declassified Joannides file makes most difficult to dismiss. It does not require believing that the entire CIA organization killed Kennedy. It requires believing that a faction within the CIA, one that had been empowered by years of secret covert operations, that had watched JFK fire their leaders and shut down their operations, that had been recruiting the Mafia as operational partners, that had a psychological warfare specialist running a Cuban exile group that publicly staged confrontations with Oswald, could have organized or facilitated what happened. The evidence does not prove this theory, but the evidence does prove that the CIA knew far more about Oswald before the assassination than it admitted, that it actively deceived every major investigation over 60 years, that it gave a medal to the man who ran that deception, and that it fought for 6 decades to prevent documents from becoming public. Those are not the actions of an innocent institution. Here is why this story is not just history. The institutions that were involved in whatever happened on November 22, 1963, the CIA, the FBI, the apparatus of American national security, those institutions still exist. They are more powerful, more funded, more technologically capable than they were in 1963. The legal frameworks that were supposed to constrain them, and didn't in the 1960s, are still the same frameworks in 2025. The pattern of behavior revealed in the JFK assassination documents is not an aberration. The same institutions that concealed information about the JFK assassination ran COINTELPRO against Martin Luther King, ran domestic surveillance programs that were illegal, lied to Congress, destroyed evidence, gave medals to the people who deceived oversight committees. And the lesson that they consistently took from getting caught was not, we need to be more transparent. It was, we needed to be better at managing the information. The Joannides revelation is not just about 1963. It is about what happens when institutions that operate in secret develop their own interests, their own logic, their own sense of what outcomes are acceptable, and then use their secrecy to protect those interests, regardless of what elected governments, congressional oversight, or the American people want. That is the story that the 62-year cover-up of the Joannides file tells. Not just who may have killed a president, but what happens when unaccountable secret power decides it is above the truth. November 22, 1963. Dealey Plaza, Dallas, Texas. We still do not know with certainty exactly what happened. We still do not have a confession. We still do not have a smoking gun document that names who ordered what. But here is what we now know for certain that we did not know before July 2025. The CIA had direct operational connections to Lee Harvey Oswald through a Cuban exile group it was funding and running, 3 months before the assassination. The CIA assigned the officer running that group to oversee the congressional investigation into the assassination. That officer deceived investigators, denied his own identity, and withheld information across 4 separate government investigations spanning 40 years. The CIA then gave him a medal. And when a congressional task force finally forced the release of his file in 2025, a congresswoman stood up and said, "We just learned definitively that the CIA has been lying for 62 years about the assassination of an American president. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is the US Congress." In 2025, saying that out loud. What we do with that information, what accountability looks like for institutions that have been lying to the American people for 6 decades, that is the question nobody in power seems to want to answer. The files are at National Archives. Go read them yourself.